The first Americans were supposed to arrive neatly, recently, and with very recognizable spear points. That was the classroom version, a clean migration, a clean technology, a clean beginning. Then Pennsylvania produced older fire pits. Oregon produced human DNA from cave deposits. Florida produced mastodon evidence underwater. Idaho placed people south of the ice before the corridor was useful. And New Mexico preserved footprints, so old they walked straight into the Last Glacial Maximum. Tonight, we open 10 case files on the evidence before Clovis. The first 9 weaken the old American origin story one site at a time. But the final file, a trail of human footprints in white sands, forces a colder question. If people were already here 23,000 years ago, what else did the textbook politely bury?
Case file number 1 begins in Alaska, where the old story should have been at its strongest. You stand in the Tanana Valley, surrounded by dark spruce, frozen ground, and the kind of silence that makes modern civilization feel like a temporary scheduling error. Archaeologists work carefully through layered soil at Swan Point, one of the oldest known archaeological sites in eastern Beringia. The site does not offer a dramatic pyramid, a golden mask, or anything convenient for a souvenir shop. It offers stone tools, stratigraphy, and the uncomfortable possibility that the northern doorway into the Americas was already being used, while the old continental story was still waiting for its entrance cue. Swan Point has produced evidence of human occupation extending back more than 14,000 years. Its early components include microblade technology, a tool tradition with connections across northeastern Asia and Beringia. These were not random chips from bored Ice Age rocks. They were part of a portable, technical toolkit suited to mobile people living in a cold, demanding landscape. The old migration story often behaved as if humans stood politely in Asia until an ice-free corridor opened, then walked into North America with the timing of a school diagram. Swan Point complicates that. It suggests that people were already active in the northwestern Gateway region, adapting to Beringian environments and carrying technologies that did not need permission from a textbook arrow. The deeper issue is institutional convenience. A corridor model is beautiful because it is teachable. One route, one direction, one first culture. The map looks clean enough for 9th grade, which is always suspicious. The real human story looks less like a hallway and more like a frontier of experiments. Coastlines, river valleys, refugia, seasonal movement, failed journeys, remembered routes, and knowledge passed through families whose names were never written down. Swan Point does not solve the entire mystery. It simply opens the door and leaves it open. The next file moves south into Idaho, where the door was not merely open. Someone had already walked through.
The second entry in the archive takes us to Cooper's Ferry, Idaho, known to the Nez Perce as Nipah. You stand beside the Salmon River, where the water cuts through western Idaho and the landscape feels older than the categories we use to tame it. Archaeologists under Loren Davis excavate hearths, animal bone, stone tools, and stemmed projectile points from deposits dating to roughly 16,000 years ago. That date is not a decorative number. It lands south of the continental ice sheets before the classic ice-free corridor was clearly available for human travel. This is where the math becomes impolite. If people were already in Idaho around 16,000 years ago, then the simplest corridor-first migration story begins to wobble. It does not collapse into fantasy. It collapses into complexity. The evidence points toward an earlier movement, likely involving specific coastal routes or edge environments that are now partly drowned by post-Ice Age sea level rise. The orthodox objection used to be elegant. If people came by the coast, where are the coastal sites? A fair question. Also a slightly strange one, given that late Pleistocene shorelines are now underwater. Demanding dry evidence from a drowned coastline is certainly tidy. It is also an impressive commitment to pretending sea level is a minor clerical issue. Cooper's Ferry matters because it does not rely on one vague claim. It offers datable context, tools. You stand besides position, a geographic position that makes the old route problem visible. It shows people living inland early enough that their arrival must have begun earlier still. It also exposes how archaeological certainty can be shaped by what survives. Inland sites sit where we can dig. Coastal sites may sit beneath water, silt, kelp forests, ports, naval zones, and several thousand years of geological inconvenience. Cooper's Ferry does not prove every coastal migration model. It does something more useful. It makes the old corridor timing look late. From Idaho, the investigation turns west to Oregon, where the evidence becomes less glamorous, more biological, and deeply annoying who prefers clean artifacts.
Item number 3 is not a spear point. It is not a monument. It is ancient human waste. You crouch inside Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon, where dust, darkness, and laboratory discipline meet in an archaeological setting no tourism board would design on purpose. Researchers led by Dennis Jenkins investigated coprolites from the cave deposits. The claim was bold. Human biological evidence in pre-Clovis contexts, supported by radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA analyses, and later biomarker work. This is not how the old story wanted to be challenged. A stone point can be debated as intrusive. A broken rock can be called a geofact. A hearth can be questioned, but coprolites are a different category of evidence. They bring diet, biology, hard and human presence into the room, quietly. Unfortunately, the early Paisley claims were scrutinized hard, as they should have been. Ancient DNA is vulnerable to contamination. Cave deposits can be messy. So critics asked whether the samples were truly human and truly ancient. The response was not a slogan, it was more testing. Later studies brought in fecal biomarkers and additional analyses, strengthening the case that humans were present in the region. Before Clovis became the official cultural bookmark, the textbook version preferred stone technology because stone points look like culture. For they can be photographed, classified, and placed into typological boxes. Paisley Caves delivered something less dignified but more intimate. Direct biological traces of people living in an Ice Age landscape. The satire writes itself, though it should probably wash its hands first. The deeper lesson is that evidence does not become valid because it looks noble. Sometimes the archive of human history is a cave deposit that survived because no one cleaned it. That is not romantic. It is useful. Paisley Caves moves the investigation from routes and tools into bodily presence. Someone was not merely passing through a theory. Someone was eating, digesting, and leaving evidence behind. The next file crosses the continent to Pennsylvania, where an old rock shelter spent decades making archaeologists uncomfortable.
The fourth folder opens under a rock overhang in Pennsylvania. You stand inside Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, where layers of soil sit like pages in a book nobody agreed how to read. J.M. Adovios and his team excavated a deeply stratified site with stone tools, fire pits, plant remains, and occupation evidence that some interpretations place at least 16,000 years old, with older dates debated. For decades, Meadowcroft was not simply a site. It was an argument with a roof. The reason is geography. A pre-Clovis site in Pennsylvania does not fit neatly into a late Western entry model. It suggests people were already far into eastern North America. before the Clovis package became archaeologically visible. If the dates are right, then the peopling process had depth, spread, and regional variation long before the old model allowed. Critics challenged Meadowcroft on contamination, stratigraphy, possible coal effects on radiocarbon dating, and whether the deposits could truly support the older ages. That scrutiny was necessary. But the pattern around Meadowcroft also reveals something familiar. When a site contradicts the model, the site is put on trial. The model, somehow, remains a respected member of the jury. This is the quiet politics of academic consensus, not a secret room, not a villain stroking a cat. Just 1,000 small incentives toward caution, reputation management, textbook stability, and the natural human preference for not rewriting lecture slides. Meadowcroft's value is not that every bold date must be accepted without question. Its value is that it forced archaeologists to ask whether the Clovis-first model was being protected by evidence or by habit. The orthodox explanation could always say contamination, disturbance, bad dating, local anomaly. Each concern might be valid in isolation. Together they began to sound like a very expensive way of saying, "Please stop arriving early." From Pennsylvania, we moved to Virginia, where sand layers added another eastern problem to a western story.
Number 5 sits near the Nottoway River in Virginia, in sandy ground that looks harmless until it starts disagreeing with the timeline. You kneel beside the excavation at Cactus Hill, where archaeologists Joseph and Lynn McAvoy investigated stratified deposits containing Paleo-Indian materials. The site is often discussed for possible pre-Clovis levels, including reported radiocarbon dates around 15,000 years ago for deeper deposits. Some claims remain debated, which is precisely why the site is useful. It shows how fragile and difficult this evidence can be. Cactus Hill is not White Sands. It does not walk into the room with thousands of fossil footprints. It is a stratigraphic case, a site where artifacts, sand, dating, and interpretation have to be handled carefully. The problem is that even a debated Eastern pre-Clovis signal forces a larger question. Why do so many early sites appear in places the old model did not expect? The orthodox response often lean on caution. Sandy sites can shift, materials can move, contexts can be disturbed, all true. Archaeology is not a motivational poster. But caution has two versions. One protects evidence from exaggeration. The other protects an old model from inconvenience. The useful version asks, what exactly moved, when, and how do we know? The lazy version says, sand exists, therefore please return to Clovis. Cactus Hill matters because it represents the gray zone of the investigation. Some sites are strong, some are contested, some sit in between, forcing the field to improve methods rather than simply choose belief or dismissal. For a documentary, that gray zone is not a weakness. It is where adult thinking happens. The deeper human question is simple. If people reached the eastern United States before Clovis, their story is almost entirely invisible except for fragments in soil. No names, no languages, no songs. Just a few objects surviving long enough to make modern certainty look overconfident. The next file takes us underwater, where Florida preserved a much sharper problem.
Dossier number 6 descends into the Osceola River in Florida. You follow divers into dark water, down into the Page-Ladson sinkhole, where visibility is limited, and archaeology becomes a slow negotiation with mud, current, and equipment. This is not the romantic version of discovery. It is cold, technical, expensive, and easy to ruin. In that underwater setting, researchers including Jesse Halligan and Michael Waters documented pre-Clovis evidence dating to about 14,550 calibrated years before present. The site includes stone artifacts and mastodon remains in a stratified context. 7 radiocarbon samples, collected immediately adjacent to a bife, support the 14,550-year age. That places human activity in the southeastern United States roughly 1,500 years before Clovis was supposed to dominate the story. The contradiction is not subtle. People were in Florida, interacting with a late Ice Age environment, while the old model would prefer them to be somewhere else, preferably arriving later and carrying the correct brand of spear point. Page-Ladson also matters because it reveals a preservation bias hiding in plain sight. Much of the early record in the southeast may be underwater or buried in drowned landscapes. If your evidence is submerged, it does not appear in a normal survey. If it does not appear in a normal survey, the map looks empty. And if the map looks empty, the textbook calls that absence a conclusion. Very elegant. Also wet. The broader power layer here is not conspiracy. It is funding, access, and technical difficulty. Underwater archaeology requires money, training, permits, and patience. A simple land trench is hard enough. A submerged Pleistocene site asks the field to change its search image. Page-Ladson does not merely add another early date. It warns us that the archaeological record is not a neutral archive. It is a damaged archive sorted by geology before any scholar enters the room. From the drowned southeast, the trail returns to Texas, where the Clovis brand name meets something beneath it.
The 7th anomaly on our list lies in central Texas. At the Deborah L. Friedkin site along Buttermilk Creek, you stand over an excavation block where the layers behave like a courtroom record. Above sits Clovis. Below sits something older. Michael Waters and colleagues reported the Buttermilk Creek complex in Science. 15,528 artifacts stratigraphically below Clovis, dated to roughly 13.2 to 15.5 thousand years ago. That number matters because small pre-Clovis assemblages can be dismissed as ambiguous, but 15,528 artifacts are not a shy footnote. They form a technological pattern: blades, bladelets, flakes, cores, and tools. This was not one suspicious rock having a dramatic career. It was a human workshop landscape. The implication is severe for the old cultural timeline. Clovis may not be America's beginning. It may be a later technological expression emerging from older populations already on the continent. That shift sounds small, but it changes the architecture of the story. First People becomes one visible tool tradition among many. Museums dislike that sentence because it does not fit neatly under a glass case. The orthodox simplification treated Clovis as a launch event. A point type appeared, therefore a people arrived. History by logo design. But stone technology does not work like a product release. Tools change with prey, raw materials, mobility, climate, teaching tradition, and social networks. A Clovis point may mark an innovation, not an arrival. The deeper institutional issue is naming power. Once a culture gets named as first, every older claim becomes an attack on the brand. Clovis was useful because it had a distinctive artifact and a continental distribution. It looked like a clean signature. But older people do not have to leave a signature that modern typologists find convenient. Buttermilk Creek forces the narrative downward, below the famous layer, into a quieter world of stonework before the brand. And just nearby, another Texas site suggests that this deeper world was not isolated.
The 8th fragment of the investigation sits in the limestone country of central Texas. At the Galt site, you walk across a landscape rich in chert, the raw material that made this place valuable to ancient tool makers. Archaeologists have documented its Clovis-class occupation at Galt, but also deeper materials connected to older than Clovis activity in the broader central Texas sequence. In plain terms, This was not only a campsite, it was a tool-making landscape with depth. Gault matters because it changes the emotional texture of pre-Clovis America. The oldest Americans were not vague silhouettes drifting across an empty continent. They selected raw material, made tools, returned to useful places, and left behind patterns modern archaeologists can still detect. That is not chaos. That is knowledge. The paradox is that Clovis looked so impressive it became a historical magnet. Its distinctive fluted points pulled attention toward themselves. They were beautiful, lethal, widely distributed, and easy to recognize. Unfortunately, recognizable does not mean first. The official story had a weakness. It mistook visibility for origin. Clovis is visible because its artifacts preserve well and its point type is distinctive. Older technologies may be less standardized, less dramatic, or harder to classify. The evidence may sit below, beside, or between the famous layers, requiring patience instead of branding. The deadpan version is simple. Archaeology found a very photogenic spear point and briefly confused it with Genesis. Gault and the nearby Friedkin evidence suggest that Central Texas was part of a larger technological landscape before Clovis reached its classic form. Whether every pre-Clovis interpretation at Gault is treated with equal confidence is less important than the pattern. The famous layer is not sitting on emptiness. The deeper lesson is about memory. Human societies leave uneven traces, a durable point survives, a language disappears, a teaching tradition vanishes, a migration route sinks underwater. Then modern people declare the surviving object to be the beginning because it is the first thing they can hold. From Texas, the map stretches much farther south to a site in Chile that made the old North American timeline nearly impossible to defend.
Number 9 takes us to southern Chile, which is inconveniently far from the Bering Strait. You stand in the wet landscape of Monte Verde, where preserved wood, plant remains, hearths, and traces of structures forced archaeologists to confront a simple geographic problem. If people were living near the southern end of South America around 14,500 to 14,800 years ago, then their ancestors had to enter the Americas earlier. A lot earlier, Tom Dillahay and the Monte Verde research team spent years defending the site through scrutiny. Eventually, Monte Verde became one of the major blows against strict Clovis-first thinking. It was not in Alaska. It was not in the American Southwest. It was almost at the other end of the hemisphere, calmly existing where the old timeline needed silence. Monte Verde is still discussed, reanalyzed, and challenged, including recent debate over aspects of its chronology. That is healthy. A site this important should not be protected from criticism. But the larger point remains difficult to erase. South American evidence means North American entry must be older than the earliest secure settlement, far to the south. The orthodox narrative asks us to imagine people arriving late, spreading quickly, adapting instantly to thousands of miles of terrain, and reaching southern Chile with remarkable efficiency. It is not impossible. Humans are competent, but the timeline becomes tight enough to start making eye contact with absurdity. The satire target is the invisible sprint. People enter, disperse, adapt, colonize a hemisphere, and leave archaeological traces near the bottom of South America before the model has finished introducing them. Admirable logistics, questionable anthropology. Monte Verde also reveals a hemispheric problem in American storytelling. U.S. audiences often treat the peopling of the Americas as a North American story with a Southern appendix. The evidence does not respect that hierarchy. South America is not the footnote, it is part of the argument. And then, After all these caves, rivers, tools, and wetlands, the final case stops being indirect. It becomes footprints.
The final file waits in New Mexico, written not in stone tools, but in mud. You stand at White Sands National Park, where pale gypsum stretches across the Tularosa Basin, and the desert hides the memory of an Ice Age lake. In that ancient landscape, humans and extinct animals crossed wet ground: mammoths, ground sloths, dire wolves, children, adults, feet pressing into mud, drying, filling, hardening, vanishing, and returning thousands of years later as evidence. USGS and National Park Service research has reported human footprints at White Sands dating to roughly 23,000 to 21,000 years ago. The first dates used seeds from the aquatic plant Rupia found in the relevant layers. Critics raised a serious concern. Aquatic plants can absorb old carbon, potentially making dates appear too ancient. That objection mattered. So researchers tested again, using terrestrial pollen and optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains in the footprint-bearing sediments. The independent estimates supported the original age range. This is why White Sands is so disruptive. It does not merely push people a little before Clovis. It places them in North America during the Last Glacial Maximum, when massive ice sheets covered much of the continent, and the old ice-free corridor model cannot casually explain the presence of humans in New Mexico. The official fallback is predictable. Maybe the dates are wrong. And yes, ancient dating should always be interrogated. But when seeds, pollen, and luminescence begin pointing in the same direction, skepticism has to become specific. It cannot simply stand in the doorway repeating no with a clipboard. White Sands also changes the emotional scale of the story. The oldest evidence is not a weapon. It is not a monument. It is not a royal burial. It is ordinary movement, people walking along a lakeshore, some of them likely children, in a world full of giant animals and climatic danger. That is the coldest part. The evidence that challenges a century of confidence may be the most human evidence imaginable. Footprints are not theory. They are contact. Body, ground, pressure, time. A person was here, then another, then another. The textbook said later. The mud said now. White Sands does not answer every question. It does not tell us whether these people came by the coast, by interior routes, in multiple waves, or through a population history more tangled than our categories. It does, however, make one thing very difficult to defend: the idea that Clovis was the beginning. The first Americans were not waiting for our permission to become ancient.
If you made it this far, you already understand the real issue. This was never just a dispute over dates. It was a dispute over how history behaves when evidence arrives out of order. Swan Point made the northern doorway older and more complicated. Cooper's Ferry made the corridor story look late. Paisley Caves brought biological evidence into the argument. Meadowcroft and Cactus Hill made eastern North America harder to ignore. Page-Ladson warned us that some of the earliest evidence is underwater. Buttermilk Creek and Galt pushed human technology below the Clovis layer. Monte Verde made the entire hemisphere part of the problem, and White Sands did what no typology could do. It let ancient people walk directly across the old model. The honest conclusion is not that every contested site is equally proven. That would be lazy. The honest conclusion is colder. The Clovis-first model survived longer than it deserved because it was clean, teachable, and comfortable. The evidence that replaced it is messy, regional, damaged, and human, which is usually how history looks before someone edits it for a textbook. Subscribe to Minimal Histories if you prefer the cracks in the story to the varnish on the display case. And in the comments, defend your theory carefully. The first Americans left footprints. The least we can do is avoid trampling the evidence.